Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a mental glitch where you only notice information that agrees with what you already believe. English psychologist Peter Wason first coined the term back in 1960. He ran a famous experiment asking people to guess the rule behind a sequence of numbers, like 2, 4, 6. Instead of testing numbers that might prove them wrong, participants only tested numbers that proved their first guess right. Your brain does this exact same thing every day to save energy. When you hold a strong belief, your mind actively filters the world around you. You search for evidence that says you are right and quickly dismiss anything that proves you are wrong. You see this happen when two people watch the exact same news broadcast but walk away with completely different takeaways. They both cherry-pick the details that fit their own narrative and ignore the rest. Today, with social media algorithms feeding you content you already like, understanding this bias matters more than ever to keep you from living in a total echo chamber. Sunk cost fallacy. This is a mental trap where you keep pouring resources into a losing situation just because you have already invested time, money, or effort. The process starts when you make an initial investment that you cannot get back. This is your sunk cost. Instead of making a rational choice based on future benefits, your brain fixates on what you have already lost. You feel like quitting means admitting defeat and wasting that past effort. So you double down. You sit through a terrible movie or spend years in a dead-end job. The visible effect is often massive financial or emotional waste. Look at the supersonic Concorde jet project in the 1960s. The British and French governments realized early on that the plane would never make a profit. But because they had already spent millions, they kept building it and eventually wasted billions on a commercial failure. This matters today because your past investments are gone forever. Learning to ignore them is the only way to make smart choices about your future and finally cut your losses. Anchoring effect. This is a mental blind spot where you rely way too much on the first piece of information you hear. Back in 1974, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran a famous experiment. They spun a rigged wheel of fortune that landed on either 10 or 65, then asked people to guess the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who saw the number 10 guessed much lower than those who saw 65. That initial number sneaks into your brain and acts as a heavy anchor. When you make a decision, you just adjust up or down from that first number instead of starting fresh. You see this happen constantly. If you walk onto a car lot and the dealer says the price is $20,000, that number takes over the negotiation. Even if the car is only worth $15,000, paying $18,000 suddenly feels like a good deal. It still matters today because whoever sets the starting number controls the entire conversation, making it incredibly easy to drain your wallet if you are not prepared. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut our brains use to judge how likely something is to happen. In 1973, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman first explained this concept. They found that if you can quickly remember an example of an event, your brain assumes that event is common. When a dramatic event happens, like a terrifying plane crash, the news blasts it across every screen. The images are vivid and easy to recall. Later, when you think about flying, those specific images pop right into your head. Because the memory arrives so fast, you automatically overestimate the actual danger. You might feel panicked boarding a flight, even though National Safety Council statistics show your lifetime odds of dying in a car crash are about 1 in 93, while the risk in an airplane is nearly 0. This mental glitch still matters today because it constantly warps our reality. It makes us fear rare tragedies while completely ignoring the ordinary risks right in front of us. Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a mental blind spot where people with low skills in a specific area think they are actually experts. The concept was named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who published their famous study in 1999. They were inspired by a man who robbed 2 Pittsburgh banks in 1995 covered in lemon juice, genuinely believing it would make his face invisible to security cameras. The cause behind this is a double curse. When someone lacks knowledge about a subject, they also lack the very knowledge needed to realize how bad they are at it. You see this play out when a beginner takes one guitar lesson and confidently tries to join a band, or when someone reads a single article and starts arguing with a doctor. Meanwhile, actual experts often doubt themselves, assuming that if something is easy for them, it must be easy for everyone else. This matters today because recognizing our own ignorance is the only real way to keep learning and avoid making terrible decisions. Survivorship bias. This is a mental blind spot where you only look at the winners and completely forget about the losers. Back in World War II, the military wanted to put extra armor on bomber planes. They looked at planes returning from missions and mapped out the bullet holes. Most damage was on the wings and tail, so the generals wanted to add armor there. But a statistician named Abraham Wald stopped them. He explained they were only looking at the planes that actually survived the flight. The planes that took hits to the engines crashed and never made it home. By focusing on the survivors, the military almost made a fatal mistake. Wald told them to put armor exactly where the returning planes had 0 bullet holes. Today, this bias happens constantly. You see a college dropout become a billionaire and think dropping out is the secret to wealth. You just do not see the thousands of dropouts who went broke. Remembering the invisible failures is the only way to see the true picture. Halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where your overall impression of someone is shaped by just one positive trait. Back in 1920, a psychologist named Edward Thorndike first noticed this when he asked military officers to evaluate their soldiers. He saw a clear pattern unfold. If a soldier was tall and stood up straight, the officers automatically assumed that soldier was also smart, loyal, and a good leader. The officers let one good physical trait create a glowing halo over everything else the soldier did. You see this happen all the time when someone is physically attractive or charming. Because they look good or speak well, you might automatically assume they are also kind, honest, or highly competent at their job. Their superficial charm basically blinds you to their actual flaws or lack of skill. This bias still matters a great deal today. It constantly warps how we vote in elections, who we hire for important jobs, and who we choose to trust, proving that a great first impression can easily hide a terrible character. Framing effect. This is a cognitive bias where your brain makes completely different decisions about the exact same information based on how it is presented to you. Back in 1981, psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman proved this by asking people to choose a medical treatment for a new disease. When the treatment was described as having a 90% survival rate, almost everyone chose it. But when the exact same treatment was described as having a 10% mortality rate, people suddenly thought it was too risky and rejected it. You see this happen every day at the grocery store. A package of ground beef labeled 90% lean sells much faster than one labeled 10% fat. Your brain naturally prefers a positive spin and avoids a negative loss, even when the underlying math is identical. It still matters today because every advertisement, news headline, and medical recommendation you hear uses this exact psychological trick to quietly steer your choices. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is that familiar feeling of thinking you knew exactly how something was going to turn out, but only after it actually happens. Psychologist Baruch Fishoff first put a name to this back in 1975. He asked people to predict what would happen before President Richard Nixon visited China and Russia. Months later, he asked them to remember their original guesses. Once the results were public history, people suddenly remembered being far more accurate than they really were. Your brain takes the new information about how an event ended and quietly rewrites your memory. It connects the dots backward, making an unpredictable world feel perfectly logical. The visible effect is unearned overconfidence. You watch a football game, see a risky play fail, and immediately declare that you knew it was a terrible idea all along. This matters because if you always believe you saw things coming, you never stop to figure out why you were actually wrong, which completely stops you from learning from your past mistakes. Optimism bias. Optimism bias is the psychological tendency to believe you are less likely to experience a negative event than the person sitting next to you. Psychologist Neil Weinstein first documented this in 1980. Today, researchers estimate that about 80% of people have this bias. It happens because your brain is physically wired to process positive future information better than negative information. When you hear a grim statistic, your brain simply assumes it applies to other people. You see this play out every day in health and finance. A person looks at lung cancer statistics but lights up a cigarette anyway, thinking their genes are somehow stronger. Someone else delays putting money into a retirement account because they assume their future self will naturally be wealthy. They skip buying flood insurance because they figure the water will just stop at their neighbor's yard. This matters because a false sense of invulnerability makes us blind to actual danger. Recognizing it is the only way to prepare for a reality that does not care how lucky you feel.